Hey there, Stitchers! Welcome back to Stab and Stitch. This week we're on location, and by that I mean we're at my parents' house, which is not necessarily on location yet, but all of my siblings are back in town from our various colleges and other places, COVID-free, of course, for Thanksgiving. So you never know; there could be a murder here this time next week. But if you're new here, hi! I'm Emily. I'm DIY My Way over on Instagram. But here I do this little thing called Stab and Stitch, where every week I sit down with a project that I've been working on, and I show you a finished object that I'm super excited about, and I tell you a true crime story. So if you're a maker, grab your whip and you can work right along with me. So before I jump in this week, I was talking to my brother today, and he was like judging me for doing this, and I told him how many subscribers I had, and he was just like, really? So I'm going to need you all, if you have not already subscribed, to go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that I can prove a point. Thank you. But so what I'm wearing, this is the Illusionist Infinity Scarf. I was actually working on it in my video a couple weeks ago, and now it's done. I love it. It's the Hue and Me yarn by 2 of Wands. If you haven't gotten your hands on this yet, oh my god, nobody can get their hands on it. It's selling out like crazy. I was super excited to get some. And I actually still have 2 full skeins of it. I haven't decided what I'm going to do with it yet, but I'm so excited. And then what I'm whipping on today is actually a little pattern that I am designing. So it doesn't have a name yet, and it's all a little bit secret, but this is what it looks like a little bit at the start. So get excited. I'm going to put a tester call out on Instagram probably sometime next week. So if you're a crocheter and you're looking for something quick to whip up for a Christmas gift, make sure that you're following me so that you can see that tester call. Trigger warning. This video includes descriptions of rape, murder, and domestic violence. Viewer discretion is advised. So this week's episode is a Canadian story. Shout out to all of my friends from Canada. This one's for you. And it is a serial killer. So thank you to everybody who voted in my poll on Instagram. I'm super excited to share this one with you. It's interesting, but it's also like a lot of information and kind of also involves another serial killer. And I've chosen to specifically talk about the parts that use our main character. So I'm going to tell you in the story where I jump around a little bit. But I think it's more interesting to look at like her holistically rather than looking at like the crimes that they both did in the trials for this one. So if you haven't guessed it already, today we'll be talking about Karla Homolka. Karla was born on May 4th, 1970 in St. Catharines, Ontario. She was the oldest of 3 girls. Her sister Lori was a year younger than her. And then her youngest sister Tammy was 5 years younger than her, born in 1975. Honestly, Karla had a seemingly normal childhood. Nobody said anything like weird or strange. She didn't exhibit any of the 3 things that people would generally associate with somebody being a serial killer. She actually loved animals. Which, like, harming animals is one of the big things that everybody's like, oh, yep, that's a serial killer. But no, she worked at a pet shop in high school. She became a vet's assistant and was a vet's assistant for a lot of her adult life before her conviction. And she was popular in high school. So during her senior year of high school, it was October 17th of 1987. Karla was attending a conference in Toronto where she met a man named Paul Bernardo. They met at a restaurant in a hotel that they were staying at for this convention or conference or whatever it was that was in Toronto, and they just immediately hit it off. So much so that they were actually engaged only 2 months later. At the time, Paul was 23 and Karla was 17, so he was a little bit older than her. But the engagement was not as short as the dating period. You know, they only dated for 2 months, but they were actually engaged for 3 years before they finally got married. Paul, he came to live near Karla. He started to get to know her family, and he got a job in the area as an accountant. So fast forward to 1990. Paul had gotten pretty close with Karla's family. He didn't really have a good relationship with his own family, so Karla's family had kind of adopted him as one of their own. He was obviously engaged to Karla. He also got very close with Tammy, and the parents would later describe it as Paul flirted relentlessly with Tammy. Tammy was 15 at the time, and he was a lot older than her, but they had a good relationship. It was kind of like a playful, flirty thing. It wasn't something that really struck the parents as like, oh, that's odd. Now, that being said, there were two important pieces of information that the family didn't know about Paul at the time, or at least that the parents didn't know about Paul. It's not clear how much of this Karla knew, and I'll explain that in a minute. So the first was that Paul had actually lost his job as an accountant. Instead, he was making money by smuggling cigarettes across the U.S.-Canadian border. And then the second was that Paul was actually obsessed with Tammy. Like, for him, it was more than just like playful, harmless flirting. He would peep through her window at night. He even was said to have masturbated in her bedroom while she slept. Now, keep in mind, she's 15 at this point, and he's either 25 or 26. So creepy, right? Ugh. Now, like I said, it's not totally clear how much of this Karla was aware of, but she actually was aware of at least some of it, because she would do things to enable it, like breaking the blinds in her sister's room to give Paul a clearer view of what was going on. So in July of 1990, Paul took Tammy with him to go across the border to get beer for a party. I think he was buying the beer for her and her friends. And he would later tell Karla that while they were there, they got drunk and made out a little, quote. Like, that was directly what he said. So Karla obviously was aware that her sister, or that, like, Paul was interested in her sister and that, like, he thought of her sister this way. Shortly after that, on July 24th of 1990, Karla actually had stolen some Valium from work. She was working at a veterinary office at this point. So she stole the Valium, she crushed it up and put it into spaghetti sauce and served it to Tammy for dinner. Now, of course, this did cause Tammy to lose consciousness shortly after. And when that happened, Paul raped her, and Karla watched. Great big sister right there. After that, it's not said if Tammy actually had any memory of this or not. I personally have no experience with that situation. Like, I don't know if she knew something happened and just didn't know what, or what was going on there. But throughout the summer, Paul would continue to give Tammy and her friends gifts and food and soda. And friends would later describe it as the soda had kind of a film and sometimes white flecks on top. So to me, it seems like maybe this wasn't a one-time thing, and that it happened several times, and maybe even to more people over the course of the summer, but that's never been proven. The next time something like this is reported to have happened is on December 23rd of 1990. It's about 6 months later, and they drugged Tammy again with a sleeping pill in a rum and eggnog cocktail. And this time, Karla had actually stolen an anesthetic called halothane from work. So they drug Tammy, she falls asleep, and Karla soaks a cloth with halothane and covers her sister's nose and mouth with it. They also undressed Tammy, and at this point, they get a video camera out and film themselves raping Tammy. And the whole time this is going on, Tammy's parents were asleep upstairs. Like, this was in the family home that this happened. It was said that Karla had wanted to give Tammy's virginity to Paul for Christmas that year. I guess Paul was kind of upset that he wasn't Karla's first. So Karla was trying to make up for that by helping him to rape Tammy as a Christmas gift. What a great Christmas gift. Please find better Christmas gifts for people. That's just creepy. Also, if your boyfriend says things like that, like, maybe that's a sign that you should not be with this person. But, so, this is going on, and while it's happening, Tammy begins to vomit. She doesn't actually regain consciousness, but she does begin to vomit. And the pair tried to revive her, tried to get her to stop puking, and she wouldn't. She just like violently puking everywhere. So they call 911. But before they do, they take the time to redress her, clean up some evidence. They even like did laundry before they called. And they put her back in her bedroom, which was also in the basement where they were. And so then they call 911. Tammy was taken to the hospital and pronounced dead a few hours later. The official cause of death was listed as choking on her own vomit from consumption of alcohol. This was the story that Karla and Paul told the police and the family. And even though Tammy actually had chemical burns on her face, this story was believed, and that was the cause of death that was listed. Now, it doesn't quite stop there. Shortly after her death, so I believe it was a few days later, but I couldn't find an exact timeline, the couple once again filmed themselves. This time they filmed Karla wearing Tammy's clothing and pretending to be Tammy while Paul had sex with her. I mean, okay, no judgment on like sexual preferences, like do what you do, but this is just creepy. So this happens, and shortly after that, they did decide to move out of their parents' home, or out of Karla's parents' home, just to give them time to process their grief and to deal with things. So instead, they moved into a rented house in Port Dalhousie, which is pretty close to where her parents lived in St. Catharines. Okay, so fast forward again. And now we're talking about June 15th, 1991. So it's about 6 months after Tammy's murder. Let's call it what it is. And it's about 2 weeks before their wedding. Paul was out late that night. He was driving around Burlington, which is a little bit out of the way from where they lived, but he was there because he was looking to steal license plates. So, you know, don't do it close to where you live if you don't want to get caught, kind of a deal, I think. So he's out driving around, and he comes across 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey. Leslie she's outside alone because apparently she had missed curfew after attending a funeral and had been locked out of her house. I don't know the whole situation, but like, who does that to a 14-year-old, especially after a funeral? Like, I have some thoughts. But so she's sitting outside alone. She wasn't able to find anyone who would let her stay for the night. And this is the point where Paul approaches her. It didn't say exactly how he coerced her into his car. Maybe he offered her a ride somewhere, offered her a couch to crash on. I'm not sure. But she starts to walk with him towards his car, and when she does, he grabs her, blindfolds her, and forces her into the car and drives her to the Port Dalhousie home. Now, this whole thing was again videotaped, and in the video, when he brings her in, he says things like, you know, I found us a playmate, when he's talking to Karla about it. So they never actually drugged Leslie. She was awake and conscious the whole time, but for several hours, the couple tortured, raped, and sodomized her. And if you don't know what that is, it's the booty, the butt. Yeah. So they did all of this, and all of it again was on film, and on these videotapes. The next day, Leslie was killed. There's different accounts on how she was killed because really the only source we have here is Paul and Karla. So Paul claims that Karla fed her a lethal dose of halcyon, which I guess would be another drug that she would have stolen from the veterinary clinic. Karla claims that Paul strangled her. Now, you'd think this is a cause of death that we'd be able to get from an autopsy and know who's telling the truth, right? But no, they made sure that wasn't going to happen. So after having killed Leslie, Karla's parents were coming over for dinner. And so they went ahead and they put her body in the basement to start with, and they had dinner with Karla's parents. And then afterwards, they were like, okay, so we have to get rid of this body. There was a lot of evidence on the body, or we can assume there was just based on the video. That's really the only source we have for this. But they decided that the best way to dispose of this body would be to dismember her, and place her, like the parts, into concrete blocks. So Paul goes to the store and he buys 12 bags of cement. He actually kept the receipts, which, like, if you're trying to hide a body, why would you keep the receipts? But he then used his grandfather's circular saw to dismember Leslie's body and poured cement around it to create these giant cement blocks. The block that they found first was actually over 200 pounds. So this was like a lot of cement. However, they didn't do a great job of hiding the body parts in the cement blocks, I guess, because didn't take too long for someone to realize what was actually going on. They had taken her body out to Lake Gibson inside of these cement blocks that they'd created, and it took them several trips, actually, to get all of the blocks to the lake. But they took them out and dumped them in the lake. I guess not all of the blocks sank. However they made them, they were wide enough that it was challenging to get them to sink, or maybe the density was an issue. I'm not a physics person, so I don't know. But at least one of them didn't and had washed up close to the shore, where it was spotted on July 27th. So just a couple of weeks later, or a week and a half later. And that was when Leslie's body was discovered. It didn't say how much of her body was ever actually found. I assume that they'd be able to find all of these concrete blocks, but it was so badly destroyed and damaged that they had to use her orthodontic appliance, or like she'd had some orthodontic work done. So they had to use that like piece of machinery or equipment that was in her mouth to identify her. Now, Karla and Paul weren't super concerned at that time because it was actually their wedding day. Yeah, they had this super elaborate wedding, partied all night, not a care in the world. After this, it seems like Karla and Paul kind of laid low for a little while. Maybe it was because the body was found, I'm not sure, but no other known murders have been connected to them between the end of June of 1991 and Easter weekend of 1992. So when they did strike again, it struck me as really bold, the way that they did it. So it's Holy Thursday, which if you're not Christian or not up with the Easter terms means it's the day before Good Friday and Easter weekend. And they were actually driving around St. Catharines, which is where Karla's parents lived, looking for potential victims. It was the middle of the afternoon, so school had just let out, and this is where they saw Kristen Ferry, who was 15 years old at the time. She was walking home from school, and they pulled into a parking lot near where she was walking, and Karla got out of the car with a map and stopped Kristen to ask her for directions, pretending that they were lost, asking for help. And while Kristen was looking at the map and talking to Karla, Paul came up from behind and attacked her. He grabbed her, dragged her into the car at threat of a knife, and then put her in the front seat of the car. Karla climbed into the back seat, grabbed onto her hair to control her and keep her in the car. And the car drove away. Now, what's bold about this is two things. First of all, like, Kristen was on her way home, and she was a very consistent person, or her parents would describe her that way. So when she wasn't home within 15 minutes of when she usually would be, because it took her about 15 minutes to walk home, her parents were concerned and thought that something was wrong. The other thing that's bold about this is that they did this in a relatively populated area in the middle of the day. So there were several witnesses to the kidnapping. Once her parents contacted the police, it only took about 24 hours for this to become a very concerning situation and a search for like violent people, right? So they actually found one of Kristen's shoes in the parking lot she had been abducted from. They had several witnesses that could describe the kidnapping from multiple angles, and everyone was on high alert looking for these two people. Kristen was taken by Paul and Karla back to their home, where they spent Easter weekend torturing her, raping her, and sodomizing her, the same way that they did with Leslie. The difference here, and it was again on video, to clarify. So the difference here was that she was never blindfolded, which prosecutors would later point to as an indication that they never intended to let her go, and that the goal was always to kill her because she had seen both of them and would be able to identify them if she was allowed to go and be free, right? So they didn't kill her until Sunday, or April 19th. And again, they have two different accounts of how she died, right? Both of them trying to pin it on the other. So according to Karla, Paul strangled her for 7 minutes, which killed her. According to Paul, Karla beat her with a rubber mallet for trying to escape, and she was strangled on a noose that was tied to a chest. Yeah, not totally sure how that one played out. That was a little bit confusing. There also was like a press freeze at the time when the trials were going on, because their trials happened like separately, and they were trying to make sure that they both received a fair trial. So it was a little bit hard to find details there. But They both accused the other of killing her. Either way, something that was consistent in both of their stories was almost immediately after her death, they got ready, Karla went and fixed her hair, and they went over to Karla's family's house for Easter dinner. Which, reading about all of this kind of struck me how often they would go see her family immediately after these murders happened, or like her family was around the murders. And it made me wonder if like this was something that related to Paul having a bad relationship with his family, and there was something going on there, that it was like a power thing or like a family, like we can keep these secrets from you thing. But I'm not a psychologist, and I didn't read that from any psychologist, so I don't know. Let me know what you think about it, if like that's connected or if I'm just reading way too into things, because I've been reading about this for the past 48 hours. So Kristen's body would be found 11 days later. She was found nude, with her hair cut off, and it looked like her body had been washed, in a ditch in Burlington that was actually very, very close to Leslie's grave. Like it was like right outside of the cemetery where Leslie had been buried. It was also later discovered, when they were doing a little bit more investigation around this, that it's very possible that police could have found Kristen before she was killed. So on April 18th, which was the Saturday of that weekend, Paul left the home to go out and pick up a pizza. And while he was out of the home, a woman named Carrie Patrick saw him and made a report with police. In her opinion, he very much matched the description of the kidnapper. Carrie was familiar with him. He actually had stalked her and her sister. But we're not talking about Paul here. We're talking about Karla. But Carrie was familiar with him, and she immediately reached out to police, was like, hey, he looks a whole lot like this kidnapper. I know that, like, he's not a good person. He's been convicted of these things. Like, we have these other issues. I think you should look into it. But the police, according to investigators later, the report was mishandled. No one ever investigated it or went to the home. And unfortunately, that means that no one found Kristen in the home before she was murdered. So Karla and Paul had both been questioned by the police several times over the years, related to Tammy's murder or death. They hadn't called it a murder yet at this point. They had also been questioned about crimes that Paul was also committing. These are the crimes we're talking about today are the only crimes that Karla has ever been tied to or accused of, but Paul was convicted on other charges as well in his trial. But when investigators looked at them, because they did look at Paul originally for Kristen's death, but they ruled that he was, quote, an unlikely suspect. Even though at the end of May, an acquaintance of Paul and Karla came forward and said, like, he probably did this. Like, I have strong reasons to believe that he did this. You really should look into him. They just didn't. They didn't see a reason to do so. He also had given DNA when he was questioned previously, but that DNA wasn't actually even tested at all until December of 1992, which was 26 months after he initially gave the DNA. Now, when that DNA was tested, they would be able to tie it to all of these things, right? But they hadn't even started that process yet until December, which was 7 months after this. He had been ruled an unlikely suspect. Now, also in December of 1992, something happened in Paul and Karla's home. It was December 27th when this happened, and according to Karla, Paul attacked her and severely beat her with a flashlight, like a metal flashlight. She had bruises on her arms, on her head, even on her face. And she actually really did not make much of an attempt to hide this. She went into work on January 4th after the holidays without really even trying to cover it with makeup or anything like that, and told her coworkers that she had gotten into a car accident, but really couldn't give them a lot of detail about it. Her coworkers were skeptical, and they called her parents. And her parents came, and they felt that they were rescuing their daughter from Paul. When they came and picked her up, they took her to the hospital, and she gave a statement there that she had in fact been a victim of spousal abuse, or domestic violence, as we would call it in the U.S. Following this, she moved out of the home and moved in with her aunt and uncle. This was a really important piece of Karla's situation over the next several months. She ended up using this instance of spousal violence, or like this report that had been taken at the hospital, to kind of play the victim. And a lot of people think that she kind of set this up that way. Just kind of keep that in mind, that there was one incidence of this and it happened right before everything kind of exploded. So February 9th, 1993, a couple months later, Karla was interviewed about Paul. At this point, the police knew that they could tie him to some other rapes that he had committed, that Karla allegedly did know about. They also had strong suspicion that he was involved in Kristen's death, and were starting to tie Kristen's death to Leslie's death. They had even at this point reopened the investigation into Tammy's murder, or like into Tammy's death, and were starting to consider it a homicide. So all of this is going on, and the police didn't share all of it with her, but they did share some of it. And even with this information, in her interview with the police, Karla chose to focus only on the abuse that Paul had allegedly subjected her to. And she went into great detail. She just very much like would only talk about that and acted like that was all that she knew about, even though we do know that she knew about some of the other things that were going on and was in videos that they would discover later. That night, back at her aunt and uncle's house, she actually admitted to them that Paul had been raping these people that he was, or that the police had mentioned that they knew he was raping. And she admitted to her aunt and uncle that she and Paul had raped and murdered Leslie and Kristen, and that it was on video. 2 days later, on February 11th, Karla and her lawyer go to the prosecutor and seek full immunity in exchange for her cooperation. They essentially went and said, like, hey, this is a battered spouse. She's willing to testify against her husband, but like he had forced her to be involved in some things, and like it was at threat of her own life potentially, especially if she's seeing her do these things to other women, or she's seeing him do these things to other women, and so like she should not be charged in any of this. Like she was not a willing participant. She was a coerced participant. It wasn't until May 5th that they offered her a plea bargain. And what they offered her was a 12-year sentence, essentially 3 counts of manslaughter, rather than other charges. And they told her that she had 1 week to accept the bargain, or they would charge her with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. So at this point, like, they were not playing around. They were like, this is it. She did accept that plea bargain. Her lawyer, I believe, accepted it on the spot, and she agreed to it later. I know in previous videos I've like gone in detail about the trial and walked you through it, but a lot of what I've told you is the facts that came up in the trial. It's also a little bit challenging to get a convincing string of the trial because of the no press rules, or like the Canada has a thing where you can kind of like prevent things from getting into the media during someone's trial if there's another person involved, to ensure that everyone gets a fair trial. So that happened at this point. Also, we're really focusing on Karla in the second half of this story rather than Paul, because this is where their paths kind of diverge. So everything that I've already talked about was covered in the trial. There was also another incident that they don't have an exact date on that was covered. When they found the videotapes, they found a video from sometime in 1991 where Karla was actually filmed sexually assaulting and raping an unidentified woman who they refer to in all of the documents as Jane Doe. They have identified who this woman is, but she was under 18 at the time and has chosen to remain anonymous. It has been reported that the woman has no memory of these events. She was drugged when this happened, and it's very likely that this happened before Leslie was murdered. So sometime between Tammy and Leslie, this happened. It's also important to note that the plea bargain that was offered to Karla came before any of the videos were discovered. Many people believe that Karla withheld evidence or didn't cooperate in a couple of different ways. So the first is that she knew the videos existed and where they were, and she didn't tell anybody. Because the videos actually weren't uncovered and turned in to the prosecution or like the state until 1994. So the plea bargain was in 1983. So she knew about him for a period of time and didn't say anything. It's also said that she intentionally concealed the Jane Doe information, which would be not cooperating, and that her claims of being coerced by Paul were not quite as true as like they sounded, especially after you watch the videos. So even with all of this potential examples of her not cooperating, Karla's deal was upheld. She was charged and convicted of 3 counts of manslaughter and would go to jail for 12 years. Before she went to jail, she was evaluated by a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists. They were just trying to understand, like, was this insanity? Was she actually a victim of spousal violence? Like, what was going on? And a lot of them did say that she showed signs of, like, being a victim of spousal violence, but many commented that it was almost too textbook and that she could have studied or been coached on how to behave that way. Like, it was just too perfect. One of them said, and I quote, that she remains something of a diagnostic mystery. Despite her ability to present herself very well, there is a moral vacuity in her which is difficult, if not impossible, to explain. Which I interpret to mean, like, there's just something off, that she doesn't quite have the same morals and, like, process things the same way as the rest of us. This, to me, screamed potential sociopath or psychopath. Because I watched all of Shane Dawson's videos last year, or when I was in college when all those came out, so. Another psychologist said, what's particularly compelling and telling is how radically different the faces that she presents to each audience are, which, once again, screams sociopath. So Karla does go to prison, and while she's in prison, she had a relationship with a woman named Linda Verno. I don't speak French. But Linda was serving time for armed robberies, and she was released pretty early into Karla's sentence and reoffended to go back to jail. Even with that, she was still released a second time before Karla's 12 years were up, and is said to have spent over $3,000 at Victoria's Secret waiting for Karla to be released. However, Karla did end the relationship before she was released from prison. It was noted that when Linda was not in prison, Karla would send her notes and things like that were eerily similar to the notes that she would send to Paul while the two of them were awaiting trial and things like that. She used the same stationery for it, very similar language in them. They were described as very juvenile, and one psychologist looked at them and described them as, quote, childish love notes. The stationery actually even had, like, puppy dogs on it and was, like, decorated. It was very weird to me that she, like, kept that and used the same language with both of them. So it says to me that she didn't actually distinguish the two of them, maybe. Again, not a psychologist, disclaimer. So while she was in prison, Karla did continue to play the blame game with Paul, and she never actually took responsibility for anything that had happened with her family. So she's, communicating with her family and sending apology letters for letting Paul coerce her, or for, like, standing by while these things happened. But if you remember from the beginning, she actually at first enabled Paul to have access to her sister by doing things like breaking the blinds, and the drugs that were used were things that she stole for him or for them to use. And in the videos, she's shown as an active participant. She even put her sister's clothes on after her murder to pretend to be her sister in a video. She gets through her 12-year sentence, doesn't apply for parole early. She served the full 12 years, even though she was eligible for parole early for good behavior. She was described as kind of a model inmate. But so she finally gets to her release hearing. And they said in the hearing that at 35, she did not represent a threat to society. She was described by one reporter as a fearless and much sought after criminal profiler. It also was said that she may be driven by malignant narcissism. But that if she posed any kind of danger, it would have to be being looped up with someone similar to Paul, who is another, like, sexual sadist, is what they described him as. But she would have to get connected with someone like him again to be dangerous, that she wasn't going to be somebody who was dangerous on her own. It also One psychologist that presented in this described her by saying she's very attractive to this world of sexual psychopaths. It's not for nothing that she did what she did with Paul. Like that this was something that she did have an interest in, and that, but through all of this, she was released. And in reports about her trial, her demeanor on this witness stand in this release hearing was described as indifferent, haughty, and irritable. Like she just wanted to get this over with because her sentence was over and she was going home. So since that time, Karla has really fought to stay under the radar, or off the radar entirely. In 2007, she gave birth to a baby boy, and the newspapers found her because she was in the hospital. Following that, she moved to Guadeloupe in the French Indies with her new husband, Terry Bordelaise. You may recognize that name. Terry Bordelaise was actually the brother of Karla's attorney. So she gets married to him, and the two of them, they have the son together. They move together. And at that point, she pretty much went completely under the radar. She was found again by a reporter named Paula Todd in 2012. And at that point, she was going by the name Leanne Bordelaise, and had 3 children with Terry, 2 boys and a girl. Her lawyer quickly shut down these interviews, but not before Paula was able to get enough to publish a 40-page ebook about her, describing going on a search for, a female sexual predator and finding a mother of 3. In the report, Paula did describe Karla as seeming like a good mother, and a lot of other things that were kind of controversial, and the public didn't really receive them very well, because they were like, this woman should be on like sex offender lists. Why are we calling her a good mother? Why is she not being scrutinized in her relationship with her children? Things like that, right? So in 2017, she made headlines again. They were, at this point, they were still in the French Indies, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce where they were living. I don't speak French. But so she made headlines again because the parents of her children's classmates discovered who she was. She had been volunteering a lot with her youngest child's kindergarten class at the time. She'd go in for hours. She would bring her dog for the children to play with. And she would even accompany them on field trips. When parents found out who she was, they immediately blamed the school for allowing a woman like this, who had been directly involved in sexual killings, to be so close with their very young children. It was also reported at this time that Karla had separated from her husband and was instead living with the owner of the apartment building that she and her husband had previously lived in together. She made headlines one more time recently, and it was actually a few weeks ago. So November 11th was when the story was dated. And it hasn't been out long enough to really have been totally confirmed yet. This is just rumors, but it was rumored that Karla is in the process of moving to Waterloo. That she was divorced from her husband and has remarried again, this time to a police officer. And of course, they're moving to Waterloo together. However, I did have a hard time confirming this story. A lot of what you find when you start to look into this, especially more recent articles, is articles about how the media is harassing her. It shows her almost looking like a celebrity avoiding paparazzi in the pictures. And I've seen a lot of things in forums and on Facebook saying that the government is putting more effort into protecting Karla from the media than they're putting into the victims' families, or like caring about the fact that this woman helped murder 3 people and is walking free. It's clear to me that a lot of people in Canada don't feel that 12 years was an adequate sentence for what happened. I personally agree. There's been a movie made and a couple of books published about her. The movie, if you watch it, really paints her as a victim, but the books tell a different story. So if you're gonna watch and look into it, make sure you do look into both sides. Because what I found when I actually went and read a lot of this online was that I really don't believe that she was a victim here. I'd be curious to know what you think, but the movie, and a lot of people see it and come out of it and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe he made her do this. But when you start to read about it and do your own research, you find that may have been her idea in some cases. But I'd love to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments. Also, just tell me what you thought of this story overall. If you're still here and you're not subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. That's okay too. You know, tell me what you really think. But I hope you all had a wonderful holiday for those that celebrated, and that you have a great time this weekend. Remember to support a small business tomorrow because it is Small Business Saturday, and all of our maker friends that sell things are small businesses, and I'd love to support them. But yeah, I will see you next week. Have a great week, guys.